Welcome back. If this is your first time with us, prepare yourself carefully. We often think of war as a symphony of chaos, the deafening roar of artillery, the shriek of engines, and the collision of armies. We imagine that a soldier's greatest fear is the enemy standing on the other side of the line with a gun in hand. But what if the true horror doesn't begin with a bullet? What if it begins in the silence of a bedroom with a single, polite knock at the door? Today, we will not turn the pages of history written by the victors. We are entering the mind of a man named Alexei, who discovered that in the Soviet Union of 1939, the most dangerous place was not the front line. It was the space between what you thought and what you were allowed to say. This is the story of the ghost standing right behind you. Let us begin. In 1939, the village lay submerged in a suffocating silence. It was not the peace of sleep, but the fearful stillness of prey holding its breath. Alexei sat by the window, the thick woolen curtain drawn tight, leaving only a narrow slit. He was only 20 years old, yet old enough to understand that in this era, sleep was a luxury reserved for the naive, and there were no truly naive people left. Outside, the moon cast long shadows like dry skeletons across the dirt road, but Alexei was not looking at the moon. He was listening. He was waiting for a sound that every soul from Moscow to Siberia had learned to fear. It was the low growl of a GIAZ M1 engine. People called them the Black Ravens. These were the steel cars of the NKVD, the secret police who served as the eyes and ears of the state. When the headlights finally swept across the wall of his room, Alexei's heart hammered in his chest like a trapped bird. The car did not stop at his house. It crept further down the street and stopped 2 houses away in front of the Baker Ivan's home. Alexei watched in numb silence as 3 figures in long leather coats stepped into the mud. There were no screams, no struggle. The terror of the Great Purge lay in its efficiency. He watched Ivan being led away in his nightclothes. Head bowed, shoulders collapsed in total defeat. Ivan had committed no crime. He had not stolen bread or spoken against the party. But earlier that week, Alexei had noticed Ivan looking at a propaganda poster in the town square. A vivid image of a smiling soldier with an expression lacking the required enthusiasm. Perhaps he had sighed. Perhaps he had frowned. It did not matter. In this world, a lack of enthusiasm was no different from treason. As the Black Raven swallowed his neighbor and vanished into the night, a cold realization crawled into Alexei's gut. The list of names was random, but it was endless. With the instincts of hunted prey, he knew that sooner or later that car would stop in front of his own door. Fear became a physical weight crushing his chest, thinning and poisoning the air inside his own home. He realized he could not simply sit and wait to be arrested. Waiting meant becoming a victim. He had to act. He had to prove his loyalty before they had a chance to doubt it. The logic was twisted, born of desperation, yet perfectly rational to his panicked mind. If he offered himself to the machine, perhaps the machine would not crush him. The next morning, the sky was a bruised, lifeless gray. Alexei walked to the recruitment office in the district center. The building was draped in enormous red banners, slogans screaming of patriotism and the glory of the motherland. A giant portrait of the leader gazed down from the facade, his painted eyes seeming to track Alexei's every step. He forced himself to stand straight, pressing his pale face into an expression of resolve. He was stepping into the lion's den to ask for a place in its stomach, believing that was safer than waiting outside. Inside, the air was thick with old tobacco smoke, damp wool, and moldy paper. The recruitment officer sat behind a tall desk, a man whose face was a mask of boredom and latent threat. He did not look up when Alexei entered. The scratch of pen on paper was the only sound in the room, loud and rhythmic, like the ticking of a doomsday clock. Alexei stepped closer and declared his intention to volunteer. He spoke of duty and honor, repeating phrases he had heard on the radio thousands of times. He waited for a nod of approval, a handshake, perhaps even a glimmer of respect for his patriotism. Instead, the officer finally looked up. His eyes were flat, devoid of warmth, assessing Alexei, not as a human being, but as a resource, a slab of meat for the grinder. The officer did not smile. He simply slid a sheet of paper across the desk and pointed with a calloused finger to the dotted line. As Alexei signed his name, the ink bleeding into the cheap paper, he felt the temperature around him drop abruptly, sending a chill through his bones. The officer retrieved the paper, filed it into a towering stack of folders, and finally spoke. He told Alexei the train would depart at dawn. There was no thank you, no welcome. The look in the officer's eyes said everything. Alexei was too afraid to admit. The trap had not been avoided. It had just snapped shut. He thought he was escaping the midnight knock of the secret police, but he had just signed away his freedom, his body, and his soul to a monster even larger, and hungrier. As he stepped back into the cold morning air, the eyes on the posters seemed to mock him. He was no longer Alexei the baker's neighbor. He was property of the state. The transition from civilian life to the Red Army was not a transformation. It was an erasure. Alexei found himself sent to a training camp that felt more like a holding pen for livestock awaiting slaughter than a military base. The barracks were long wooden structures reeking of unwashed bodies, damp sawdust, and the metallic tang of fear. Inside, rows of iron bunk beds were packed so tightly a soldier could hear the heartbeat of the man beside him. But this closeness did not breed brotherhood. It bred suspicion. Training began before sunrise and ended long after sunset, dragging on through exhausting days that left no room for weakness. They were taught to march until their feet bled, to strip and reassemble rifles until their fingers went numb, and to charge straw dummies with fixed bayonets, as if the enemy were not human but themselves. Alexei soon realized that the physical strain was only a distraction. The real training was psychological, designed to shatter individual will and replace it with unquestioning collective obedience. The architect of this mental reshaping was Commissar Volkov, a man who seemed not to walk, but to glide ever present in the camp like an unavoidable shadow. He stood in darkness during roll call, watched from the edge of the mess hall, observing the recruits with the cold detachment of a scientist studying lab rats, forcing every gaze downward in fear. He never raised his voice, and he never needed to. In his hand was always a small black notebook, more terrifying than any weapon in the armory. When Volkov opened that notebook and scribbled a note, lives would end. On the third day, he assembled the platoon in the muddy yard under rain falling like icy curtains. No one dared to shiver as the commissar announced that intelligence reports indicated 3 traitors among them. He did not name names, he simply sowed suspicion into every face. He declared them saboteurs, enemies of the people seeking to weaken unit morale, and emphasized that their duty was not only to train but to watch one another. Listen and report. Alexei felt cold sweat break across his back as he looked at the faces of the men he slept beside each night in the cramped barracks. Suddenly, they were no longer comrades. They were potential spies, or worse, potential informants. The barracks had become a glass cage with no secrets. There were no walls to shield them, and nowhere to hide. Every whisper could be interpreted as dissent, every weary sigh as weakness. Alexei decided his strategy would be invisibility. He became a ghost in the machine, marching in step, eating his rations without complaint, always keeping his eyes on the ground. But not everyone was so careful. In the bunk beside him was a young man named Dima, a farmer with a loud laugh and a naive heart that had not yet learned the rules of the game. Dima treated the others as friends, sharing jokes and complaining about the blisters on his feet. One evening, after an 18-hour shift, they were served a miserable meal. Dinner was nothing but hot water with a few grains of millet floating in it, the literal food of a starving man. Exhausted and hungry, Dima pushed his bowl away and muttered a fatal sentence. He said that even the pigs back in his village were fed better than the men guarding the Soviet Union. The silence that followed was instant and absolute, heavier than the damp wool blankets. Dozens of eyes flicked toward Dima and then quickly away in fear of association. In the corner of the room by the door, Commissar Volkov stood watching in silence. He said nothing. He simply opened the black notebook, made one precise mark, and closed it again. Dima realized his mistake too late, forcing a weak smile and eating his thin gruel in despair. That night, Alexei could not sleep. He lay awake listening to the rhythmic breathing of hundreds of men around him until the door creaked open sometime after midnight. There were no heavy boots, only the soft shuffling of rubber-soled shoes. 2 men approached Dima's bed, and the muffled sounds quickly dissolved into silence. Then everything returned to stillness. Alexei squeezed his eyes shut, pretending to sleep, his heart pounding so hard he felt the entire room could hear it, but he did not move and he did not intervene. He knew that helping would mean disappearing along with Dima. The next morning, when the reveille trumpet sounded, Dima's bed stood empty, its cold iron frame bare and the mattress stripped. No one asked where he was. No one spoke his name, as if Dima had never existed. During morning inspection, Commissar Volkov walked along the ranks, his gaze sweeping across each face. When he stopped in front of Alexei, he hesitated for a split second and gave a thin, knowing smile, as if to say that he knew Alexei had been awake and had heard everything. By doing nothing, Alexei had passed his first test. He learned the most important lesson of the Red Army: loyalty to the state always mattered more than loyalty to one's brothers. As they marched out to the training ground, Alexei realized that the war had already begun. He was walking among the living dead, and the man with the black notebook was death itself, waiting for the next careless word. The transition from wooden barracks to the front line in 1941 was not a journey through space, but a free fall into madness. The train was a suffocating nightmare of crushed bodies and stale air. But what awaited them at the end of the rails was a sight that defied all human comprehension. The ground here was not earth. It was a pulpy mixture of mud, snow, and pulverized flesh. The horizon was permanently stained black by burning oil, and the air vibrated with a low, continuous sound that ground against the inside of Alexei's skull. They were told they were deployed to defend the motherland, to become a shield smashing the fascist wave. But as Alexei stood in a frozen trench water seeping into his rotting boots, he realized they were not a shield. They were gravel desperately thrown under the wheels of a runaway truck in the hope of slowing it down. The failure of logistics was absolute. Propaganda reels showed soldiers well fed and fully armed, but the reality was a scarcity so extreme it bordered on criminal negligence. Many men in Alexei's unit were issued ammunition, but no rifles to fire it. Others received rifles so rusted they were jammed solid relics from a war their grandfathers had fought. They were ordered to collect weapons from the fallen, an instruction that turned every corpse into a resource chest. Alexei gripped his Mosin Nagant tightly, the wooden stock slick with damp his knuckles white. He had 5 rounds, 5 slivers of lead to stop the mechanical monster called the Wehrmacht. But the true horror of the front line was not the poverty of supplies. It was the geography of death itself. At the end of July, an order came down from the Kremlin, rippling through the ranks like a shockwave. Order number 227, Ni shagu nazad, not one step back. It was an order that stripped the soldier of his survival instinct. Retreat without permission meant death, and to ensure the order was obeyed, the ghost of the training camp followed them. Behind the regular infantry lines positioned on higher ground with clear fields of fire stood the blocking detachments. These were NKVD troops, well-fed, warmly clothed, and equipped with heavy Maxim machine guns. Their barrels were not pointed at the Germans. They were aimed squarely at Alexei's back. The signal to attack did not sound like a heroic trumpet call, but like a scream of terror from the political officer. Forward for the motherland. The soldiers climbed out of the trenches, their bodies silhouetted against the ashen sky. Immediately, the German defensive line erupted. The sound was unlike anything Alexei had ever heard, a tearing noise, as if the sky itself were being ripped apart by invisible claws. Bullets screamed through the air around him, and mortar rounds turned the ground into geysers of black mud. Soldiers fell like puppets with their strings cut. Beside Alexei, a young soldier, whose name he had not even learned, froze in place. The density of the fire paralyzed him. He dropped his rifle, his eyes wide with a raw, animal panic. He turned around. He did not think of ideals or patriotism. He only wanted to live. He tried to crawl back toward the safety of the trench, scrambling on hands and knees, crying as he went. Alexei watched time seeming to slow as the boy reached the edge of the trench. He expected him to jump down and find cover. Instead, the Maxim machine guns on the hill behind them opened fire. The sound was unmistakable, a rhythmic, mechanical pounding. The boy's body jerked violently as large caliber rounds from his own countrymen tore him apart. He collapsed into the mud, his back shredded, his face turned toward Alexei in a final expression of betrayal. He was not killed by the invader. He was slaughtered by the very state he had sworn to defend. A cold, lucid realization pierced through Alexei's panic. He was trapped in a corridor of death. Ahead of him was the German war machine, efficient and impersonal. Behind him was the Soviet meat grinder, paranoid and ruthless. There was no safety in retreat. There was no mercy in surrender. The only mathematical probability of survival, however slim, lay in the chaos ahead. If he ran back, he was a traitor to be executed. If he ran forward, he was a hero who might get lucky. Fear of the NKVD machine guns proved stronger than fear of German tanks. With a scream that was not a battle cry, but the release of pure terror, Alexei forced his legs to move. He charged toward the German lines, not to kill the enemy, but to flee from the monsters watching from behind. He ran into the hail of bullets, understanding for the first time that in this war, the bullet that kills you does not care which side of the border it was made on. The assault against German firepower blew Alexei's unit apart like dry leaves in a storm. By some miracle, or perhaps a curse, Alexei was not among the fallen. He crawled through frozen, mud-filled shell craters and found shelter in the ruins of a bombed farmhouse, specifically in a root cellar beneath charred wooden beams. He was not alone. 5 other men had also slipped into the suffocating darkness of that underground sanctuary. Among them was Mikhail, a schoolteacher from Kyiv, who had shared cigarettes with Alexei during long nights of marching. Mikhail was a kind man, the sort who always kept a photograph of his wife in his breast pocket, and spoke of the future as if it were a guaranteed destination. For 2 days, the 6 men huddled in the damp earth, listening to the battle rage above them. They were cut off, surrounded, and forgotten. Hunger was a living creature gnawing at their stomachs with sharp teeth. Thirst forced them to lick condensation from the cold brick walls. In this tomb-like confinement, the shell of ideology began to crack. The men whispered. They spoke of incompetent generals, the cruelty of the blocking detachments, and the impossibility of victory. Mikhail, his voice hoarse from dehydration, dared to voice the forbidden thought. He whispered that perhaps surrender was not death. He wondered aloud whether the Germans might treat them better than their own commanders, who were ready to shoot them for stumbling or falling behind. It was a moment of weakness, a desperate man grasping for hope in a hopeless place. Alexei listened, and deep down he agreed. But walls have ears. On the third morning, the shelling stopped. The heavy wooden hatch was thrown open, flooding the cellar with harsh gray light. It was not the Germans standing there. It was an NKVD patrol led by Commissar Volkov himself. His uniform was impossibly clean amid the filth of the front line, his boots polished to a dull shine. He descended into the cellar, not as a rescuer, but as a judge. He looked at the 6 gaunt, trembling men and did not see survivors. He saw deserters hiding in a hole, while their comrades died. Volkov did not shout. He spoke softly, his voice echoing in the cramped space. He told them he had been standing by the cellar door for a long time before opening it. He had heard the whispers. He had heard the talk of surrender. He opened his black notebook, the rustle of paper cracking sharply in the dreadful silence. He made an offer, a cruel game designed to test the limits of their souls. He said he could execute all of them on the spot for treason, or they could point out the ringleader. If they identified the man who had poisoned their minds with defeatist words, the rest would be spared and returned to the regiment. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Alexei felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at the others. All of them were staring at the floor or at the walls, anywhere but at each other. Then Volkov's eyes settled on Alexei. The look was expectant, predatory. Alexei knew the truth. He knew Mikhail was just a frightened schoolteacher, not a traitor, but he also knew that Volkov did not care about the truth. He cared about a name. He needed a scapegoat to keep the system alive. Alexei looked at Mikhail. Mikhail was looking back at him, his eyes wide with pleading trust and desperation. But the survival instinct is a parasite that corrodes morality. In that split second, Alexei imagined a bullet piercing his own brain. He saw the darkness of the grave, and he was terrified. His hand moved before his conscience could stop it. A trembling finger rose and pointed across the small room. It pointed straight at Mikhail. Alexei heard his own voice, distant and unfamiliar, declaring that Mikhail was the one who wanted to defect, that the others had tried to stop him. Mikhail did not scream. He simply collapsed, the light in his eyes extinguished even before he died. The betrayal struck him harder than any physical blow. Volkov nodded, satisfied with the transaction. 2 guards grabbed Mikhail and dragged him out into the snow. A moment later, a single pistol shot rang out. It was a small, dry sound, insignificant against the backdrop of the war, but it shattered Alexei's world. Volkov closed his notebook and motioned for the others to move outside. They had been saved. As Alexei crawled out of the cellar, stepping past the still warm body of his friend, he vomited violently until his stomach was empty. He had passed the test of survival, but he had failed the test of humanity. In that moment, he realized that the shadow behind him was no longer the political commissar. It was the man he himself had once been. The temporary reprieve granted by Commissar Volkov was short-lived. War was a greedy beast that demanded constant feeding, and Alexei's unit was eventually swallowed up in the catastrophic encirclements of the months that followed. But being captured by the Germans did not bring the relief of safety. It brought a new, more complex form of horror. Alexei found himself herded into a vast, open, fenced enclosure on the frozen steppe. A place history would record simply as a stalag, a prisoner of war camp, but those inside knew it as the waiting room of the afterlife. There were no barracks, no sanitation, and almost no food. Only acres of barbed wire enclosing a sea of gray, shivering people huddled together like cattle in a storm. Physically, the camp was a nightmare of dysentery, typhus, and gangrene. Men collapsed and died where they stood, their bodies stacked like firewood against the fences because the ground was too hard to dig graves. But for Alexei, physical pain was secondary to the psychological torture gnawing at his mind. In the Soviet Union, being taken prisoner was not considered the misfortune of war. It was regarded as a malicious act of treason. Stalin had made this clear with Order No. 270. There were no prisoners of war, only traitors to the motherland. Every man behind that barbed wire had effectively been sentenced to death twice over. With a heavy heart, Alexei realized that he was now a man without a country. If he died here, he would be buried in an anonymous mass grave. If he somehow survived and returned home, he would not be welcomed with parades, but with the cold interrogation rooms of the NKVD and a one-way ticket to the Gulag. This awareness created a sick, maddening paradox in his mind. Part of him wanted the Red Army to smash the German lines and liberate them, but a darker, more selfish part of him feared that liberation. Freedom meant judgment. The sound of Soviet artillery drawing closer did not sound like rescue. It sounded like an execution squad marching nearer. To survive, Alexei retreated deeper into the shell of anonymity he had built. He tore the insignia from his tunic, discarded his identity papers, and buried them in mud mixed with excrement. He stopped speaking altogether. He became a cipher, a non-entity, trying to erase his own history, so that no one, neither German guards nor Soviet informers, could attach a name to his face. He moved with the sluggishness of the dying, conserving every calorie of energy, his eyes always cast downward, scanning the ground for potato peels or cigarette butts. But starvation is a hallucinogen. As his body consumed its own muscle mass, his mind began to fracture, and the boundary between reality and memory dissolved. In fevered delirium, the faces of all the dying men began to resemble Mikhail. When a prisoner begged for water in the dead of night, Alexei heard Mikhail's voice. When he looked at the piles of corpses being loaded onto carts, he saw Mikhail's eyes staring back at him with that final look of betrayal. The ghost of the man he had sacrificed to save himself in the cellar followed him into the camp. Mikhail was no longer just a memory. He was a constant, accusing presence. He sat beside Alexei in the mud, whispered in the wind, whistling through the barbed wire, asking again and again why his life had been worth less than Alexei's. One night, amid the groans of thousands slowly dying, Alexei found himself crying. He did not weep for lost freedom or the pain in his gut. He cried because he realized he had become something worse than a traitor. He was a survivor who had paid for his breath with the blood of the innocent. The Germans could only kill his body, but the system he had served had killed his soul long ago. He lay in filth, shaking violently, yearning for the end, yet terrified of what lay beyond it. May 1945 arrived not with the warmth of spring, but with the cold, unyielding light of judgment. The war in Europe had ended. The Third Reich had collapsed into ashes, and the gates of the German prison camps were finally thrown open. But for Alexei and millions of other Soviet prisoners, the moment of liberation was a cruel illusion. They did not walk out of the camps, into the arms of weeping mothers, or onto trains bound for home. Instead, they were marched directly from one cage into another. The Germans were gone, replaced by the unsmiling forces of the NKVD and SMERSH. The barbed wire remained, only the language of the guards had changed. This was the process of filtration, a bureaucratic purgatory designed to sift the returning army and find the grains of treason. The filtration camps were places of suffocating anxiety, where the air was thick with cheap cigarette smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies sweating in fear. Rumors spread through the camp like a disease. Some said everyone would be shot. Others claimed they would be sent to the Japanese front. But the most terrifying rumors were about the re-education camps in the Far East, the gulags, where people vanished into the white silence of the tundra. Alexei sat on his bunk, his emaciated body tense, his mind racing. He spent entire days rehearsing his story, polishing his lies until they shone like truth. He could not admit that he had been captured while conscious. That was a crime. He had to invent an injury, an explosion that knocked him unconscious, a scenario in which capture was a biological inevitability rather than a choice. He repeated the details to himself, dates, locations, the sound of the shell. He had to believe it, or the man across the table would smell deception. When his name was finally called, Alexei felt a physical shock as if he had been punched in the chest. He was led down a long, dim corridor to a small interrogation room. The room was bare, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a single light bulb dangling from a frayed wire. Behind the table sat an NKVD captain. He did not look like a monster. He was a bureaucrat, a man with ink stains on his fingers and a stack of files piled to his elbows. He did not look up when Alexei entered, merely reading his documents and letting the silence stretch. It was a calculated tactic, a psychological vice designed to squeeze a confession out of silence. Finally, the captain looked up. His eyes were colorless, tired, and utterly devoid of compassion. He asked Alexei's name, rank, and unit. Then he asked the question that would decide his fate. How did you fall into enemy hands? Alexei began his speech. He spoke of the explosion, the darkness, waking up in a German truck. His voice was steady, but under the table his hands clenched, his knees so hard his fingernails dug into flesh. He watched the captain's face for any sign of disbelief, any flicker of doubt. The captain listened, smoked the smoke curling around the light bulb like a serpent. He wrote nothing down. That gaze was the most terrifying weapon Alexei had faced in 6 years of war. It was the look that said, "I know you are lying. I know about the cellar. I know about Mikhail." For a horrifying moment, Alexei felt an urge to vomit out the truth, to confess everything, just to end the pressure. But he swallowed the scream, kept his gaze dull and submissive. He was playing a game of poker with the devil, and his life was the chip on the table. The captain finally stubbed out his cigarette and pulled Alexei's file toward him. He picked up a rubber stamp, held it hovering over the paper for a painful second, then slammed it down with a dull thud. He did not say "you are free," nor did he say "you are guilty." Alexei was free to leave, but his internal passport would forever bear the mark of a former prisoner. He was a second-class citizen on the very land he had fought to defend. He had survived the filtration process, but he had not been cleansed. As he walked out through the camp gates, he realized that the war would never end for him. In 1950, Moscow had rebuilt itself into a monument of imperial grandeur. Metro stations gleamed with marble and chandeliers, and Stalinist Gothic skyscrapers pierced the clouds, proclaiming the absolute triumph of the Soviet system. But beneath the streets, under the shadows of these architectural giants, another reality crawled through the melting snow. They were called samovars on the streets, a cruel, dark nickname derived from the traditional Russian tea kettle. These were veterans of the Great Patriotic War who had lost all their limbs, left with only their torsos. They propelled themselves along the sidewalks on crude homemade carts fitted with ball bearings, using wooden blocks in their scarred hands to move. They were the fragments of victory, living reminders of the blood-soaked price the state wanted to forget, amid the splendor of parades and triumphant songs. Alexei walked among them, a ghost in a gray coat. Physically, he was intact with arms, legs, and sight. To the casual observer, he was one of the lucky ones, a hero who had survived the meat grinder. But inside, Alexei felt more broken than the men on carts. He lived in a permanent state of imposter syndrome. Every time he passed a samovar begging for a few kopecks near a train station, he felt nauseous. He saw Mikhail's face in them and felt his own wholeness was a theft, a prize he had stolen by pointing a finger in a root cellar years ago. He walked faster, eyes averted, terrified of being recognized. The city was preparing for another victory celebration. Red flags hung from balconies, fresh paint coated the facades of government buildings. But beauty demanded the removal of eyesores. Alexei witnessed the cleanup one evening on his way home from the factory. Police trucks stopped at markets and train stations, and efficient, impassive officers lifted the samovars off the ground and threw them onto the truck beds like sacks of potatoes. The men on the carts did not scream. They knew their place. They were relocated to remote northern islands, to special care facilities hidden from the public and foreign officials. The heroic myth had no room for crippled bodies. The state that had once demanded their limbs now regarded their presence as an embarrassment. Watching from his window, Alexei trembled, realizing the system had never changed. Alexei returned to his cramped room in a kommunalka, sharing a kitchen and bathroom with 4 other families. It was like the glass cage of the training barracks, except everyone wore civilian clothes. The walls were thin. Every conversation was a potential indictment. Alexei lived in silence, never speaking of the war, never wearing his medals, keeping his head down, working his shifts, then returning home. One evening, while drinking tea, a sharp knock echoed through the apartment, a single, authoritative blow against the wood. The sound stopped Alexei's heart, and time collapsed completely. He was no longer in Moscow in 1950. He was back in the village in 1939, in the cellar with Volkov in the filtration room. His hands shook violently, spilling hot tea onto his thigh, but he felt no burn. He slid out of his chair, crawled under the table, curled into the fetal position, waiting for Boots, waiting for the Black Raven, waiting for the judgment he had been fleeing for 11 years. The doorknob turned, but the door was locked. A voice sounded in the hallway, not the NKVD, but the neighbor's young son, asking if Alexei had any matches for the stove. The boy waited, then ran off, his footsteps fading away. Alexei remained under the table, trembling in the darkness, and realized that the real knock would never come. Because the prison was no longer made of brick or barbed wire. It was inside his skull. The war had ended for the world, but for Alexei it would never end. The ghost no longer stood behind him with a gun. It had moved inside him. He had survived enemies' cold and purges, but he had become his own jailer. And that is the tragedy of Alexei, a story absent from the newsreels of 1945. We measure the cost of war by lives lost, but rarely by the souls destroyed that continue to wander. Alexei's journey shows that the most terrifying thing about a totalitarian system is not only physical violence, but how it forces you to compromise your humanity just to keep breathing. If this story sent a chill down your spine or made you see history differently, consider subscribing and liking. It helps us bring more forgotten shadows into the light. Share your thoughts. What would you have done in that cellar? Would you have pointed at someone else to survive? Until next time, keep your eyes open. Goodbye.